Is that right though? I mean, is it something that thoughts can't be controlled by the state? I mean, if I might just play devil's advocate here for a minute. I mean, I think if we is thought crime in a sense not a kind of in some ways dissenting from an ideology? A state operates, or any civilization operates, through the internalisation of its practices by its participants, and as such, thought crime is rife, always has been rife. I'm, for example, I was brought up as a Catholic. In the Catholic Creed, they talk about forgive me for my sins, in my thoughts and in my deeds. So the idea of this is nothing new. This is not something that that was either discovered by George Orwell or is a sort of feature which is, I think, unique to totalitarianism. The idea of thought crime. I mean, thought crime is any kind of deviance. I mean, do you think that there is such a thing as thought crime in Western liberalism, if we might, agree that we live in a kind of political culture which you might loosely call liberal?
anything that is an orthodoxy, anything that is an ideology, out of that can come the delegitimization of other ways of thinking that may be opposite or threatening or different. So everything has the capacity to criminalise thoughts, I think. And again, that was what's so brilliant about 1984. So that on one hand, we live in a free society. We don't live in Iran. We look at what's been going on over the past couple of weeks, or China, which really are extreme societies, totalitarian societies. But we all recognise those elements of totalitarianism, the totalitarian gene that exists in any society, whatever its ideology, I think. I haven't answered your question.
Well, I think, no, I think you are, actually. I think, this is obviously is a very complex
I was actually thinking
area.
what you're saying is sort of Western liberalism. I was trying to think if we were supposed to be thought crime, three panelists here, Joe would clearly be Julia, and I would be, Matthew would be Winston, and I would probably be the pudgy, second-rate propagandist.
I want to be Big Brother.
And kind of clearly there is a sort of, it's easy to draw kind of a series of correlations between thought crime and or dissent and any number of sort of things that are disturbing in Western society, whether it's kind of echelon sort of spying or telecommunications, which you could relate to the kind of wire in 1984 or anything else, or whether it's the way, control orders or any number of things. But I think one of the things that's important when you look at 1984 and when you look at sort of Orwell's work generally is what he says is that freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 = 4. It's not the freedom to say 2 + 2 = 5. And so there has to be a point at which you look at where the real enemies are, and the real enemies of freedom of expression and freedom of thought are those people who distort reality, who distort the world around them. And generally, until Henry Porter gets vaporised or something similar, then really, although we can worry about these things, the places where we should be worrying are places like North Korea, places like Iran, places like China, where these threats to freedom of expression are real rather than ones that we impose upon ourselves.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned 2 + 2 = 5, because why shouldn't we be free to say 2 + 2 = 5 as well? I mean, surely this is, without wishing to be absurd. I mean, for example, one of the things that you can be imprisoned for in a supposedly Western liberal country, in Austria, is Holocaust denial. So that is a question, isn't it? I mean, of 2 + 2 = 5, because it's clearly absurd, I think, to deny the Holocaust, but yet you can be imprisoned for thinking absurdity. I often have, I'm not going to share them with you, I often have things which I think would probably qualify as thought crimes to a kind of to a Western liberal, and mercifully, because I regard myself as well, that's not against me. I curtail my thoughts. I don't necessarily say, but what do you think? The 2 + 2 = 5. Surely, if you're either free to say anything after that's been contested, or not.
Well, this is actually comes down to, even in the UK, an argument we made when it came to the question under the Labour government that Tony Blair promised to ban certain Islamist groups such as Hizb ut-Tahrir. Now, we are the most vocal in criticising such groups, but yet we stood up and opposed banning this organisation, because it's not a violent organisation, it's not a terrorist organisation, though it is an extreme and reprehensible organisation. And we said that there needs to be a distinction between what we call legal tolerance and civil tolerance. You can legally tolerate a non-violent expression of an idea, even if it's in its most extreme and reprehensible form, but that doesn't mean you have to tolerate it in civil society. And so my view is that if somebody, for example, as a member of such organisations, says something, it's our duty in civil society to challenge that and to stand them down and refute them. But we don't necessarily have to ban views that aren't violent. And Holocaust denial then comes back to this same point. And I don't think it should be banned. I think it's really strange that it is banned.
But before we stray too far down that path, though, what we must remember, we are talking about thought crime, okay, rather than the actual necessary expression, which takes us into, which puts this whole discussion in a rather strange kind of nebulous area. What the thought, and what the relationship is between thought and action. I mean, do you think that thought is, Joe? Do you think that thought crime is a form of self-censorship?
Definitely, yes it is, that's exactly what it is. And I was just saying, just to sort of answer what you talk about, that it's a thought and not an action, is where the most interesting examples there have been are people doing research and getting into trouble. And there's one instance that I'd be very interested to know what you think about, which was this very famous case of a couple of years ago now, Samina Malik, who was prosecuted. And part of what the main evidence against her was material that she had downloaded. She'd also had email exchanges with somebody who was also prosecuted, but the main evidence against her was the poetry that she'd written and the material that she downloaded that showed a concerning interest in violence and jihadi activity. But at the time, when a lot of people were writing about it, they talked about it being thought crime, and that she'd been prosecuted for thought crime. And the police went crazy. I think Peter Clark at the time was the head of the Metropolitan Police, and he said this is not thought crime. And I think Ken MacDonald as well, who was still the head of the CPS, said this is not thought crime, this is an action. But very interestingly, the case was then overturned on appeal. And that is, and I think also we see this with legislation that's come in fairly sort of recently on violent pornography, again, where you might be researching something, and that's, so research is very connected to thoughts. I think in that way you can perhaps talk about these things in thought crime, but it's a very difficult area. Well,
this is why I began by saying it's an oxymoron, because I don't think in its truest sense you can ever police thoughts or prosecute for thoughts. You always have to look at actions. You always have to look at speech and say, you're thinking this because you said this or you did this. But it's important to actually point out that it's an oxymoron, because you're then demonstrating that to try and police such things is futile. And the only true police of thoughts, the only true policeman of thoughts is God, because if you believe in God, no one really knows what someone's thinking. So it's always going to come down to actions. In that particular case, it was an action, but I still think that it's useful to describe it as thought crime, because what you're trying to do is to say to somebody, you shouldn't be thinking that, because you wrote it and that means you are thinking it, and we don't want you to think it. Because what that particular lady was doing was actually expressing her anger through poetry, and it was extreme, and obviously we disagree with that, and my job is to challenge those ideas. That's what I do every day. But I don't think she should have been prosecuted for writing a poem. I used to listen to, in my teenage years, I used to listen to hip-hop music and Public Enemy, and if you heard some of the things that those rappers say, and there's actually somebody today called Immortal Technique, who's actually he's a rapper who is not from the old sort of groups, but he's a modern guy, he's in New York, and some of the lyrics that this guy comes out with, and he's perfectly free to roam around in New York and sing and rap and talk about sort of flying planes into people's buildings, and no one's arrested him because he happens not to be a Muslim. So I think we've got to be very careful here. I think the best way to challenge these sorts of ideas is to debate them, is to expose them, is to bring them out and demonstrate how ridiculous they actually are, rather than just to throw people in prison.